I have spent a great many years with the young and the restless, long enough to understand that its most powerful stories are rarely about the events themselves, but about the emotional echoes those events leave behind. And as I reflect on the current arc involving Sally Spectra and Billy Abbott, I find myself returning to a familiar but deeply human theme. What it truly means to hope again after loss has already rewritten your expectations of life. For viewers of our generation, those of us who have lived long enough to understand that joy and fear often arrive hand in hand, this storyline resonates in a way that goes far beyond simple drama. At first glance, Sally's gradual acceptance of her pregnancy appears almost gentle by the standards of this show. There is no immediate explosion, no shocking revelation in the early stages, only a quiet shift in her demeanor, a softening of resistance. And yet, if we look more closely, we see that this acceptance is not born of certainty, but of necessity. Sally is not embracing motherhood because she feels entirely ready. She is embracing it because life has presented her with a moment she cannot control, only respond to. That distinction matters. It reflects a kind of maturity that I think the writers have been careful to cultivate in her character over time. Billy's role in this journey is equally compelling, though I would argue it is more fragile than it first appears. He steps into the position of support with a sincerity that feels earned, not performative. We have seen Billy in many phases: reckless, self-destructive, searching. And here, there is a sense that he genuinely wants to be steady, to be someone Sally can rely on. But I cannot help but ask, is stability something Billy has truly mastered? Or is he simply holding on to it because he fears what will happen if he lets go? That question lingers beneath even the most tender moments between them. The introduction of medical checkups and the possibility of a twin pregnancy adds another layer, one that is both hopeful and quietly unsettling. Twins, in the language of storytelling, often symbolize abundance, an unexpected doubling of life, of possibility. But in this context, they also represent a doubling of risk, a magnification of every fear Sally and Billy already carry. And that is where the past becomes impossible to ignore. Both characters have experienced the devastating loss of a child, and that kind of grief does not simply fade with time. It reshapes how one approaches every future moment of hope. So when the doctors begin to suggest the possibility of twins, what should be a moment of joy becomes something far more complicated. Can they allow themselves to feel excitement, knowing how fragile such happiness can be? Or does the memory of loss inevitably overshadow every hopeful expectation? I believe the show is asking us to sit with that discomfort rather than resolve it too quickly. Because in real life, as many of us understand all too well, joy after loss is never pure. It is always accompanied by a quiet, persistent fear. What I find particularly effective is the way Sally's internal conflict is portrayed not as dramatic outbursts, but as subtle shifts in behavior. She listens more carefully, hesitates more often, carries a kind of emotional weight that is visible even in silence. This is where the writing aligns closely with lived experience. Trauma does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it reveals itself in the spaces between words, in the moments when a person pauses just a little too long before allowing themselves to believe in something good. Billy, on the other hand, seems to approach the situation with a kind of cautious optimism. He wants to believe that this time will be different, that they will be able to hold on to what they have been given. But there is also an undercurrent of urgency in his actions, as though he is trying to secure a future before it has fully formed. And I wonder, does this urgency come from hope or from fear? Is he building something lasting, or is he trying to outrun the possibility of loss? The dynamic between them becomes even more compelling when we consider how they navigate these emotions together. There is a quiet understanding, a shared recognition of what they have both endured. And yet, they do not always express that understanding in the same way. Sally leans toward introspection, toward cautious acceptance, while Billy leans toward action, toward reassurance. Neither approach is wrong, but the difference between them creates a tension that feels both authentic and necessary. For those of us who have watched this show for many years, there is also a broader context to consider. The Young and the Restless has long explored the idea that happiness is rarely permanent, that every moment of peace exists alongside the potential for disruption. This does not make the joy any less meaningful. In fact, it may make it more so. Because when we know something is fragile, we hold on to it more carefully. I find myself thinking about how this storyline might have been told in earlier decades of the show. There might have been a clearer division between hope and fear, a more straightforward emotional trajectory. But what we are seeing now is something more nuanced, more reflective of the audience that has aged alongside these characters. We understand that life is rarely so simple. We understand that it is possible to feel grateful and afraid at the same time, to look forward and backward in the same breath. And so I return to the central question. What does it mean for Sally and Billy to move forward? Is this pregnancy a second chance, an opportunity to rewrite a painful past? Or is it a test, one that will reveal whether they have truly learned from what they have endured? I would suggest that it is both, and that is precisely why it feels so compelling. There is also the matter of trust, not just between Sally and Billy, but within themselves. Can Sally trust her own ability to hope again without being overwhelmed by fear? Can Billy trust that he is capable of being the partner and father he wants to be? These are not questions that can be answered quickly, and I would caution against any attempt by the show to resolve them too neatly. The strength of this storyline lies in its willingness to linger in uncertainty. As I reflect on all of this, I am reminded of why I have remained invested in this show for so long. It is not simply the plot twists or the dramatic revelations, but the way it captures the complexity of human emotion over time. We see these characters not as static figures, but as people who grow, falter, and try again. And in that process, we see something of ourselves. So, as we watch Sally attend her medical appointments, as we see Billy stand beside her with a mixture of hope and apprehension, we are not just witnessing a storyline. We are witnessing a reflection of a universal experience, the desire to believe in something good, even when the past has given us every reason to be cautious. The courage it takes to move forward, not because we are certain of the outcome, but because we understand that life does not wait for certainty. And perhaps that is where this story finds its quiet power. Not in dramatic declarations or shocking twists, but in the simple, profound act of continuing, of choosing to hope, even when hope feels fragile. For those of us who have lived long enough to know the weight of that choice, it is a story that feels both familiar and deeply moving. As always, the future remains uncertain. The possibility of twins may bring joy, or it may introduce complications that test Sally and Billy in ways they cannot yet imagine. But whatever comes next, I find myself less interested in the outcome than in the journey itself. Because in the end, it is not the resolution that stays with us. It is the experience of watching these characters navigate the delicate balance between fear and hope, loss and renewal. And that, perhaps, is why we continue to watch. Not because we expect everything to turn out well, but because we recognize something true in the struggle itself, even when hope feels fragile. For those of us who have lived long enough to know the weight of that choice, it is a story that feels both familiar and deeply moving. As always, the future remains uncertain. The possibility of twins may bring joy, or it may introduce complications that test Sally and Billy in ways they cannot yet imagine. But whatever comes next, I find myself less interested in the outcome than in the journey itself. Because in the end, it is not the resolution that stays with us. It is the experience of watching these characters navigate the delicate balance between fear and hope, loss and renewal. And that, perhaps, is why we continue to watch. Not because we expect everything to turn out well, but because we recognize something true in the struggle itself. Think to turn out well, but because we recognize something true in the struggle itself.